And we're back with our sports documentary themed show on the Screen Team, brought to you by Whitworth Gift Chest Jewelers, where Walmart is next door to us, Poplar, Bluff Drywall, and also Fearless Social. Our final documentary we're going to review is called Pony Excess. It's a 30 for 30 documentary produced by ESPN. And, Kyle, this has to do with a college football program, correct?
Yes, Southern Methodist University out of Dallas, Texas, and Dallas is the optimal, place to focus on in this. It's also narrated by Patrick Duffy.
Really?
Bonus, because he was on Dallas. Very prevalent during the 70s and 80s. The Southern Methodist football program had a very rich history in the 40s and 50s. The National Running Back of the Year award is named after one of their greats, Doak Walker, and he was a Heisman Trophy winner there. But they fell on hard times in the 50s and 60s. They were looking for any edge because they were competing in a conference that is now defunct, the Southwest Conference, which included national powers like Texas A&M. You also had Arkansas in there, and all of your other smaller Texas schools like Baylor, Texas Christian, Rice, and Houston. So they were looking for any edge. Southern SMU is a deep-pocketed university. It's a private school, a lot of money. They had a lot of boosters. So they decided, if we're gonna cheat, let's cheat. So they started looking for the best high school players, not just in the state of Texas, throughout the country, and at one point, they wound up going down to Sealy, Texas, and they found a running back, and the head coach was told, I want you to look at everyone on the field and point out the best athlete on the field, and he found him. His name was Eric Dickerson.
Eric Dickerson, oh wow. He played for the Rams, right?
Yes, he did. He was the second 2,000-yard rusher in league history. He's a Pro Football Hall of Famer, and he was originally committed to Texas A&M, and then word came about of him driving a black Firebird. How in the world could he afford that? Because he came from a, pretty impoverished home, and there were allegations that Texas A&M might be trying to buy this kid off, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, and recruiting season down in the state of Texas is about as big as the Super Bowl, if not bigger, because football is as big as Chuck Norris in Texas. So, all of a sudden, out of the blue, Dickerson decommits from Texas A&M, which was a perennial power at the time and still is a big-name program, and commits to Southern Methodist University out of nowhere. Granted, they have had no prior success in the previous decade. So the problem was the NCAA started to funnel in on them, saying this program shouldn't be getting guys of this caliber.
Of course.
All of a sudden, they were bringing in top-tier talent, and they also brought in another running back named Craig James, who had originally committed to Alabama, and he decommitted from Bear Bryant, of all people, for Little Southern Methodist.
Wow.
People started thinking something's wrong here.
A lot of red flags going on.
Indeed, but they had nothing they could prove immediately. The first year, the group of freshmen, which was the top recruiting class, they went 5-7, but the next year they knew they were ready. And then the red flag game hits whenever they go to Austin, Texas, playing the almighty Longhorns. You're not supposed to beat them. You're SMU. They beat them, I believe, 20-7.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, everyone's looking into them like, okay, this is a problem. We need to start looking in. And they dominate the season, and they wind up getting banned from postseason play, and they play Arkansas in what they called the Textile Bowl because it didn't mean anything. That's the second season. The first year, they lost to BYU in the Holiday Bowl on what was deemed the greatest fourth-quarter comeback ever on a Hail Mary by Jim McMahon.
So it's back. Why did they get banned from postseason?
Because the NCAA didn't have the proof they needed. They just went off of a hunch.
So they banned him off of a hunch?
Off of a hunch, which is completely jumping the gun, and it's wrong.
Wow.
I wasn't in agreement with that watching this, and I thought, well, if you don't have any concrete proof, it was after that third season, then they got a whistleblower out of a player from the Pennsylvania area who Southern Methodist was paying their family, this kid's family. They were taking care of them, giving them all of this money, but he wasn't happy there, so he spoke up. And then the whistle blew. Their head coach, who was named Ron Meyer, he suddenly just left out of the blue. He took a job with the New England Patriots. He led them to the Super Bowl against the 85 Bears. We know how that ended.
Right.
And then they brought in another coach. His name was Bobby Collins out of Mississippi. He was just a guy who wanted to be a football coach. He wanted no part of any other trouble, just wanted to coach football. But the problem was they had funneled so much money into these players in this program, they couldn't stop paying them. They had to because they owed these kids. They had to continue them on throughout the duration of their scholarship, buying their food, paying for their places, anything they needed, cars, everything. Literally, it was buying players. At least, as one of the former boosters said, at least we bought players who could play. There were teams in their conference like Rice who were buying players and still finishing 3-9. He said, that's the epitome of a loser.
Yeah,
Let's give them that much. Now, in the third season, when they beat Arkansas in the Textile Bowl, quote unquote, it's not a real bowl game, they finished undefeated. They were the only undefeated team in the country, but were not voted number one because of the perception that they were getting of purchasing players. They gave it to Penn State, who had one loss. Let's give it to the cleaner program, image-wise. If only they knew what would happen later.
Right, exactly.
And then another player who was a top recruit, his name was David Stanley, he blows the whistle saying that the school gave him and his mother $25,000 to keep quiet. He came out in a huge story that was covered on Dallas's news station.
Apparently, that was a bad investment.
Extremely, and well, it didn't work out. He was also a very undisciplined player. He had some issues with drugs, and it got really, really bad. And then they interviewed the president of the university, asking him to identify his signature on several pieces of stationery. Said that's not his, and he looked really embarrassed. It looked terrible. And then by 1987. The NCAA officially dropped the biggest hammer that they possibly could, called the death penalty.
And what's that?
The death penalty, no football for an entire season, no scholarships, no games. Whenever you return to play, no scholarships. They had to compose a team of entirely walk-on players.
Really?
It got really bad. And some of the former players who were in the NFL said, what are these kids doing in our pads? They look like they were my size. You know, they didn't look like young men. They looked like eighth graders playing against college football teams. They were looking forward to their first game, which was, as they kept saying, 9-89. The players who were under scholarship to the program when the death penalty was hit were released from their scholarships, and basically they were like free agents. They could go wherever they wanted to play.
Yeah.
You had a bunch of coaches in there looking at these guys like they were cattle. It was crazy. But the first game they had was against Rice, which I believe they lost. But their second game was against Connecticut, and they won on a last-second touchdown pass. They called it the Miracle on Markham. But the next game they took was against Notre Dame.
How'd that turn out?
Defending national champions. It was 58-6. The head coach of the new head coach of SMU to clean up their program was Forrest Gregg. He was a former player there, SMU man through and through, very man full of integrity, and he played for the Green Bay Packers. When you're playing for Vince Lombardi, you can't do better than that.
Right.
They played Notre Dame. Notre Dame didn't want to play them. They actually felt bad. They did not want to do this to these young kids, but they said, no, we insist, we want the game. And it gets bad enough to a point where you have a running back who runs out of bounds on purpose.
That's pretty bad, man.
But wait, there's more. They play the University of Houston, which is a rival in a conference game. Houston was running what they called the run and shoot offense, which is it's a fast pace. Think of the Greatest Show on Turf, but in college. Before that became a popular style, throwing the ball all over the place. The final score was 95-21.
That's terrible, man.
They threw for almost 1,000 yards in this game.
Wow, that's like a video game, man.
I don't think I've done that. I actually take pity. I punt. But
go
ahead.
We only have a few minutes left. How has the SMU program progressed in the past 20 years?
They did not. From
years.
1989 to 2009, one winning season. I saw them play in 2007. As I attended Arkansas State at the time, we beat them by 17 points. They lost 10 games. In 2009, they brought in former NFL coach June Jones, who brought that fast-paced passing style of football to SMU's program. They cleaned it up, started over, and in 2010 made their first bowl game in 29 years, and they won. I watched that game, and it felt great to see them succeed and thrive.
Yeah.
They produced a couple of NFL players, Emmanuel Sanders, who's a star receiver for Pittsburgh. They have a Pro Bowl punter named Thomas Morstead, who plays for the Saints. Before this past season, they had winning seasons in the 5 of the previous 6 years. They went 1-11 this year, rebuilding, but it was just so nice for a short time period in the last few years to see them succeed again. And this shows that no program deserves that type of punishment. Yeah. But you also should never go as far to say, we can't get these guys on our own merit, so let's buy them off. That's the most egregious thing I've ever heard of in collegiate athletics.
Yeah. It's a great documentary. It's called Pony Excess, produced by ESPN and their 30 for 30 series. Kyle, thank you so much, man. It's been an awesome experience watching these documentaries and learning more about the sports world, man.
Hey, you got it. It's a big passion of mine. I'm glad to bring it to you.
Coming up next week, your good friend, my good friend, the newly engaged Matt Whitworth will be on
Absolutely.
the show. And we're going to be reviewing a few flicks. The first one is an old Humphrey Bogart film called We're No Angels. The next film is a Jake Gyllenhaal film, which was released in 2014, called Nightcrawler, and a brand new film to theaters called Kingsman: The Secret Service. We'll review all three of those next week for you. For Kyle and Chris, we are the Screen Team on today's Talk 930 KWOC.